Hello and welcome. This is Tiger Lily. I am so glad that you are here today. Welcome to our interview series, Succinct and Substantial. On today's interview, I'm very excited to introduce you to our fellow Earthling, Summer Crawford. Summer has had a multitude of careers, including yoga teacher, lawyer, business owner, and mom. But most importantly, for our conversation today, she is a professional astrologer. Summer, welcome to Succinct and Substantial.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Our first question today is what is so important about having our birth chart read, our natal chart?
Yeah, this is such a good question because I think so many people are really interested in astrology and are really curious about it. And probably for that reason, there is a ton of information out there on the internet, a lot of content, and people who find themselves drawn to astrology. I think there is this inner knowing that there are patterns in human life and patterns in nature. And I think that's what draws a lot of people to astrology because there's just this instinctive awareness that understanding something about these patterns and the symbols that represent them can help us understand ourselves. So we're out there and we're looking, and most of us know our sun sign. And some of us even, become aware of transits that are happening. We know when Mercury is retrograde. We may know when there is an eclipse, but we don't really have a container to put all of this in. It's served to us a la carte. And I think a lot of people think that seeing a professional astrologer and having your birth chart done is sort of a point that's further on down the line. And that requires a certain amount of buy-in, or, I'm doing air quotes here, belief to get to that point. And I feel really the opposite. I feel like having your birth chart read and consulting with an astrologer is actually step one if you find yourself drawn to astrology in any way, because then you know what you're looking at when you're consuming all of this information. And most importantly, you know how to put it into context for yourself and your own life. So I think that we start off knowing our sun sign, but this is really just one aspect of what you're going to learn about when we look at your whole chart. We live in a really solar culture that tends to value solar qualities, and those would be ambition and a sense of our own agency, recognition, yourself as the main character and actor in the story of your life. This is your sun. And so it makes sense that, I mean, those qualities probably sound we they're familiar to us because that's what our culture is constantly telling us is important. How are you getting recognition? How are you exercising your own sovereignty? And so it makes sense that this is what pop astrology tends to focus on the most. When we look at your whole chart, we are, of course, going to look at your sun sign because those solar qualities are an important part of our lives, but they're not the entirety of our lives, and they're not even the entirety of our character, our personality. So when we look at a birth chart, we're looking at the sun, but we're also looking at all of the other planets, and we're looking at all of the other signs. This is one of the things that I think people are the most surprised to realize when they have a reading is that you are not just a Leo or a Libra. Every chart has all 12 signs, and it's just a question of what area of your life is that sign expressing itself through. All the charts include all the planets, all the houses, all the signs, and each one is like a mandala where the different relationships between those things can combine in infinite ways. And I think that sometimes people think you have to be a certain kind of person to get an astrology reading. You have to be into the woo-woo arts, or, like I said before, you have to adopt a certain set of beliefs. And I don't think that's true at all, because if astrology teaches us anything, looking at your chart one time will really confirm for you that there are infinite ways to be a human being and have a human experience. And your way is just one. And this can really be liberating because, we tend to think that the things that are hard for us are hard for everybody. The things that come easy to us are easy for everybody, and we might not appreciate them. And so when we look at the birth chart and we see this beautiful and complex picture of not just a personality, not just a sun sign, but an entire life. So this encompasses your fate, your fortune, the things you choose, the things you don't choose. All of the elements of your life represented symbolically. And you can really start to appreciate the ways that your experience is unique, and also the ways that all of the astrology stuff that you're encountering or you're consuming, when you're out there pursuing those things, you can see how that actually is relevant in the context of your own life and experience.
What I'm hearing in particular, I jotted down a couple of things as you were talking, is that what the natal chart provides us just beyond, and I'm going to sort of age myself here. What I grew up with was the daily horoscope in the newspaper, and then the monthly horoscope in my favorite magazines. And those were always focused on the sun signs, and they were always just a very brief paragraph. And sometimes they were relevant and sometimes they weren't. And I think now, based on listening to what you're saying, is that the reason that sometimes they landed is because sometimes it was like whatever transit was happening happened to be landing right in my part of the chart for that day in the sun sign. But that the bigger and more complete usage of the natal chart is to take into consideration all of those complexities, and that we are not just our sun sign, just like we are not the name that we're given when we're born, right? There's a lot more to it than that. And that there are lots of layers of complexity that then, although it's based on the birth chart, my understanding too, from what you said, is that there's a whole lot that happens to us just throughout our life that is written in the stars and in the planets, and that there's a lot more to it than just that single sign that was when the sun was in when we were born. Um, so I'm
Right.
curious then, you had mentioned that it's all 12 zodiac signs, but I understand we also have a rising sign and a moon sign. Aside from all of the other parts of our chart, and I think some of the content that people absorb nowadays through all of our social media channels have started to a little bit give people a little bit more context in talking about our rising sign and our moon sign. So, can you talk a little bit about those two other aspects of our chart, and then how that all plays into the entirety of our chart, and how that can give us a little bit more comprehensive sense of the perspective that astrology offers us?
Absolutely. The rising sign is actually the most important um, single element of your chart, because it's the rising sign that sets the entirety of the rest of the chart in terms of what sign is on what house. And I'll back up a little bit and explain what I mean by that. So the way that we cast a birth chart is the moment that you're born. The chart is like a snapshot of that moment of where each of the planets were in their own orbits around the sun, but also from our geocentric perspective on Earth, where the planets were in our ecliptic. So when we look up in the sky, was a planet rising over the eastern horizon? Was it culminating overhead? Was it setting in the west, or was it underneath the Earth? So if you were born, you Tiger Lily, I happen to remember, were born around midday. And so if we look at your chart, we're going to see the sun right at the top in the 10th house. So the rising sign is quite literally what was rising, what part of the zodiac was rising up over the eastern horizon at the exact time that you were born. Whether or not the sun was there, it could have been midnight, but there would still be some part of the sky rising. And there may or may not be planets that were rising along with it. But either way, that sign becomes your rising sign, and it's your first house. And of all the things in the chart, the first house and the rising sign is what represents you. So this is often what we think of as the sun sign. Your rising sign is, in fact, your body, your mind, your spirit, your character. I've heard it described as the vehicle that you're driving around the world in. So if you're Scorpio rising, you're driving around the world in a little Scorpio vehicle. The rising sign also tells us what planet rules your ascendant. So, as a Scorpio rising, the planet that rules your first house, your rising sign, is Mars. So, where Mars is placed in your chart is also going to tell us about where you locate your sense of self, what area of life, and then in what sign, how are you expressing your sense of self in your life. So, for that reason, the rising sign is super important. Now, you talked about horoscopes. So, before we leave rising sign, I want to just mention how those are related. Whereas I also grew up reading for my son's sign in the newspaper and magazines. Um, the way horoscopes are actually written, if they're written by an astrologer, sometimes they're not. But when an astrologer writes them, they're actually using your rising sign because, for instance, right now, Venus is passing through Aquarius. So an astrologer is going to look at that and tell you something about the presence of Venus in whatever house Aquarius is in your chart.
Okay.
So for me, I'm an Aquarius rising. Right now, Venus is passing through my first house. Hopefully, I'm looking lovely because of that. Um,
Yes,
but
you are. And for those of us
but
who are just listening on audio, you can take our word for that. Some are looking.
yes, just please believe me. Um, but I'm going to write horoscopes based on, I'm going to tell you that Venusian things are going to be popping up in whatever area of your life Aquarius is in your chart. So because of this, it actually is going to be so much more resonant to read horoscopes based on your rising sign rather than your sun sign. Like you said, there will be times when it does hit anyway, because if a planet is transiting over your sun, that's going to represent something happening in your life that you will probably feel or observe. So sometimes it will hit reading for your sun sign, absolutely. But for more consistent accuracy, you're going to want to read for your rising sign. And, this kind of just makes me think of another thing I want to mention about why you want to have your birth chart read. Part of that is because I want to teach you how to read your own birth chart. I mean, I I absolutely want to work with you and give you my perspective, but my goal is for you to, like I said, build that container so that when you are made aware of astrological events or you are consuming astrological content, you are going to have some understanding for yourself of how it fits in. Um, so I just think that's really important because everyone's going to have their own interpretations. And that's not to say that astrology is all vibes. I think that's another big misunderstanding is that it's completely intuitive. And undoubtedly, there is an element of allowing intelligence to speak through us, whenever we're using a tool like this. But there are really internally consistent rules and logic and underlying philosophy to this system that if you can start to understand, it's really going to unlock and open up and bring alive a lot of this kind of a la carte astrology content that you may come across. So that's the rising sign. The moon sign is another the sun, moon, and rising are what you often will see called the big three, because
Okay.
even if you just know these three, that can give you a lot of information about what you're working with in life. So, like we talked about, the sun is your sense of agency and free will, and the moon is kind of its opposite. The moon has to do with fate and fortune and the material world, the body, the things that come into being and pass away. The sun is more of like a platonic ideal, the spirit of a thing, and the moon is the body of a thing. So, how does this translate into our life and our birth chart? Well, the best way I've ever heard it described, and anyone who's had a reading with me will recognize this framing. The sun is like the plot of the movie, and the moon is like the setting. So, the plot is a thing that you, as the protagonist, can drive. The moon is just sort of what you're working with, you know? And growing up in the 80s and 90s and consuming astrology, I was always familiar with the moon as our emotional self. And I think that that does fit in to this framework because our emotions are often the setting of our lives, you know. There are those things that, like the moon, are constantly changing. They have many phases, and they sort of make up the soup that we're swimming in on any given day. Now, can our free will come to bear on our emotions and our context? Of course. You know, the sun and the moon will interact in a chart in all kinds of different ways.
Just like
Um,
they do in the actual sky that we look at.
exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And one of the things that we look at in a birth chart is the phase of the moon. You know, if the moon is full in your chart, this is going to have different implications than if the moon is new or if the moon is waxing or waning, you know, because as you said, in the sky, they have a relationship, and in your life, those things will have a relationship too. You know, the ways that we are either resisting our circumstances, working with our circumstances, you know, these things are in flux throughout our lives, and our birth charts and the transits to our birth chart can tell us a lot about where we are in that particular cycle or pattern.
This is fascinating stuff, Summer, and I really appreciate your taking the time to really dive into some details about this. Now, we've talked about the natal chart, and I've had my natal chart read by you, and it gave me so much more perspective. Literally, it gave me so much more perspective on not just those aspects of my chart that were that snapshot that you talked about, but because you put the things like my rising sign and my sun sign and my moon sign in context, but then all of those other houses that you talked about. And of course, I'm not an astrologer. My principal interest in this structure of symbolic thinking, and I love that you brought that in earlier in talking about, interacting in this symbolic way that does kind of pull in some of our intellect and intuition. But there's also this, as you said, this internal, consistent, reliable data, if you will. And the
Mm.
thing that has always drawn me in that symbolic thinking is the tarot. And as you were going through talking today, and then as we went over my natal chart together, I found a lot of connections that made a lot of sense to me within the aspects of the tarot, which also has a sun card and a moon card and a star card, which I kind of think of as the rising sign aspect in the tarot. The other thing that I thought was really, really helpful was the fact that I had follow-up consultations with you, right? So we had the natal chart reading, and that gave me a really deeply grounded sense of not just my outward personality, but as you were referring to the rising sign and the moon sign, so many things that did not make sense to me as a quote unquote Leo. I just
Right.
thought, you know what, this doesn't really quite fit with how I feel internally on a day-to-day basis and how I sort of feel like I conduct myself. Maybe this is the way I'm seen from the outside. But once we went over my natal chart, so many things really fell into place for me in understanding myself a little bit better. What was even more useful to me over time was the next times that I met with you, and we talked about those specific transits that were happening in that moment. And I came to you with some, what I thought was, okay, here's what I feel like is going on. Can we talk about this? And that as you were looking at my transits, you were like, no, 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 no. Here's what's actually happening. Here's the thing that's showing up in your chart right now in this moment that is asking you to pay attention to this particular thing. And after all of that, sort of fell out, if you will, and the consequences of everything that we were talking about right then, I felt like, well, shoot, I felt like, okay, so Summer was giving me some advice, and then maybe I didn't follow your advice to the nth degree, and things did not turn out the way that I was hoping that they were going to turn out. In fact, they turned out pretty badly and created a lot of struggle on the back end of that. And it made me start thinking about, is this just fated? Did I ignore these aspects of things? And now I've landed in this situation where I'm having to deal with something that I didn't want to have to deal with. It's very challenging. So is it fate? Is it free will? And does it really matter? I guess is one of the questions that I had about that.
Yeah, this
Aside
is
from the just the understanding that we get from looking at all aspects of our chart.
yeah, this is really getting at the heart of what astrology is and what it can do for us and how it can be useful. It is my personal belief in my practice that the planets are not causing things to happen in our lives. Um, Even I sometimes fall prey to talking about it that way, like, oh, Mercury is really screwing everything up right now. I don't actually believe that this is the way that it works. Rather, like we talked about earlier, I believe that there are patterns that are observable in nature, in the way the planets move through space, and in human life. These patterns, if we zoom out, or even if we zoom in enough, we can observe that they are mirroring each other. Now, why is that? I have no idea, and I don't need to know. This comes back to you don't have to believe in anything. This is a tool that you can either use or not use. You don't have to be any particular kind of person, and you don't have to believe in anything metaphysical, or you don't have to have the answers. I don't have the answers about how the universe works. So why would I know how and why astrology works? What I do know is that it works because uh, the patterns that are unfolding in our lives are always going to be symbolically reflected, described by what the planets are doing. So when you ask, were those unfortunate events fated? You know, I don't know. The themes that were appearing in your life around that time, if we looked at the chart for that moment 100 years ago, it would have been the same, you know? And if 100 years from now we looked back, we would see those themes. So, to a certain extent, we could describe the fated aspect of it as yes, there was going to be certain archetypal themes unfolding at that time because we were just in that part of the cycle. Whatever the cycle is, we were there and we could see that in the chart. Now, does that mean that nothing you could have done would have affected it one way or the other? I don't know. And I tend just on a personal level to believe the answer is no. I don't think that we're helpless in the face of fate. You know, Fate can be thought of as kind of the game board that we're on. We don't necessarily choose that. We can't choose other people's actions and personalities and the ways that those might affect us. We can't choose where we're born, when we're born, to whom we're born. There's a lot that's just already set up, but we can choose how we're going to navigate that. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that those archetypal themes would not be playing out either way, but you making different choices vis-a-vis those things may make it go down a little easier or smoother, because there's always going to be light sides and dark sides to the way that different themes can manifest in reality, right? So you take an archetype like Mars. Fundamentally, Mars has to do with things that we would describe as negative in human life: fighting, separation, severing, burning. Archetypally, this is what it means. Now, in our human experience, sometimes we need that, and we will experience an objectively negative thing as good. So some things need to be severed. You know what I mean? Like if you have a cancerous tumor, you want it to be cut off. The action of cutting is, air quotes again, negative. The end result in your life doesn't have to be negative. So this is kind of how I see us interacting with our fate and the themes that we can see coming. We don't necessarily know how those are going to play out because we're not taking into account when we look at that how we are going to be manipulating the situation through the exercise of our own free will.
I love the way that you put this because what it brings to mind for me is that it isn't fate versus free will. In other words, it isn't the binary. And that's
Right.
really the illusion that
Yes.
we're sort of that we grow up in, right? That's our environment that we grow up in, thinking that it's one or the other of anything. Take your pick, gender, race, whatever you have. And what I feel like what you're saying to some extent is that one of the things that astrology can teach us is that the binary is actually the illusion, and that what's really true here is the relative multiplicity of everything and the complexity of everything. And that, yes, some things are set for us and situated for us just by the circumstances of our birth and the people that we encounter. But there is a whole lot of maneuvering room for us as individuals within that context.
It
That
is
makes me feel a
absolutely.
lot better.
Yeah, yeah, it's not fate or free will, it's fate and free will. And these two things are in a dance throughout our lives. I can choose I'm going to the grocery store today. That's my free will. I don't choose who I'm going to run into there. That's fate. They're constantly um, playing with each other. And that's something that we see in so many different aspects of astrology is the necessity of holding uh, the tension that exists between two poles. There is a lot of polarity in astrology, but not in human life. And this is another way that I think having a reading with an astrologer or studying it more seriously yourself, that can really help us see, because I think that sometimes we consume astrology content and we can get really stressed out. Because we don't have a container to put it in. The other thing that can happen is we start to stereotype ourselves. We start to stereotype other people, like all of fill in the blank sun sign are liars, don't date them, that type of thing. And I've laughed at those memes myself. Don't get me wrong. I'm not judging anybody for making them or enjoying them,
We all live in this realm.
of course. But I do not think that we are served by interacting with astrology that way, because it flattens it out and it prevents us from really. I mean, this is where I think people start to think, oh, they need to believe in it. Because if you see something that says all Geminis are liars, no offense to Geminis, it's just an example, um, you're going to see in your life that that's not really true. So you start to think, okay, well, astrology is just a party trick. Astrology is just for fun. It's just goofy, but it's not really real. When you start to learn more about it through getting to know your birth chart better, following your own transits, things like that, you don't need to believe anything because you see it for yourself. It proves itself because you can see where a certain transit is happening in your chart, and then you can identify in that area of your life, oh, yes, I see that playing out. I can point to concrete events, or I can actually identify internal states that are described by that thing in astrology. So now all of a sudden we're out of the realm of, okay, I either choose to believe or not believe this kind of wacky thing. And we're in the realm of you're seeing it, you know.
I've
Um,
certainly seen that for myself on a personal level, having engaged with you as an astrological consultant, and been able to dive deeply into some things within my both my natal chart, and then when I met with you in subsequent meetings where we went over those transits that were happening right in that moment, and I found it very useful. And so I want to start steering the conversation towards encouraging anybody who's watching or listening to this to dive a little bit deeper into some of the tools of astrology. As you said, Summer, this is a tool that can be used or not. I can tell you for myself that I've found it to be a very useful tool, particularly when you go beyond. And yes, it can be really fun to consume all of that content. It can be fun, and funny especially when we encounter different personality types in our life. And, that it's that point of recognition, I think, that can sometimes create that sense of, oh, I've got you pegged, right?
yeah.
But at the same time, we're all more complex than, whatever those, whatever that just little sound bites gives us, or memes give us. Um, so tell us a little bit about, if you would, and we're rolling up on the last few minutes of the interview time. So I want for you to tell us a little bit about, what if I were coming to you for the first time for a natal chart reading, what would be some things I would want to get together, and what would be the overall process for that?
So the main things you need is your birth data. We need to know the date you were born, the place you were born, and the time you were born. If you don't know the exact time, this is something that we can still work with. Even just knowing if it was daytime or nighttime is going to give us a lot to work with. And there is actually a process called remediation, where rectification, excuse me, chart rectification, where we can go a little bit deeper over a number of sessions and look at events that have happened in your life and kind of get around to your birth time through the back door. Um, Once we have that, I create your chart. We would sit down either in person or on Zoom. And the more context that you can bring to a reading, the more you're going to get out of it. This isn't a situation where you're testing to see, oh, what's it going to tell me about myself? Because the this is a symbolic map of your life, and I can tell you what the symbols mean. And in that sense, it's very objective, but you're the one that's going to be able to connect the dots in your own life. So I would just say come prepared to have a conversation, to think deeply about your life, to ask questions. The more you ask questions, the more we're able to kind of drill down on what's important because otherwise, there's so much information. It's like a fire hose.
Indeed.
So it's through a conversation that we narrow down, okay, what is this really about? And the chart of the moment itself will also tell us something about why you're there. That's one of the most things that blows my mind the most consistently. When people book a reading, I can look at their chart. I can look at what's happening that day they booked and think, okay, I got a pretty good idea of why you're here.
And
And
that certainly happened when you and I met. That
mm,
I came with some preconceived notions, and then what you brought from those transits that day, it was like, oh, I was thinking along entirely different lines, but now that you brought it to light, it's obvious. It was quite obvious that that was one of the things that I needed to be attending to.
it can be
Uh,
disturbingly objective, and there are some things
yes.
that are in our blind spot and they're evident in the chart, even if they're not evident to us. But then once we see them in the chart, then we can start to integrate them.
I think that's one of the things that I found the most useful too, was that ability, and that really shows the objectivity of it as well, right? That it's not just this loosey-goosey, airy-fairy, that there's really a lot of concrete things that you can get a hold of with those tools of astrology. So you had mentioned that you can meet in person. So that's for folks who live in the Tampa Bay area, or you can meet Summer online from anywhere by Zoom. So let's talk a little bit about how people can find you and how people can book appointments with you. And with that, I want to ask a little bit about why you named your business Post Saturn Astrology. And your website is postsaturnastrology.com. So that's easy to
Yes.
find. So tell
Yes.
us a little bit about why you named it Post Saturn Astrology.
So the name came to me in a flash, much like the name of my youngest daughter. I just dreamed her name. I didn't really choose it. Post Saturn astrology came to me like a lightning bolt as I was about to have a reading. I get readings myself. I try to do it at least twice a year. I think it's so valuable. And I learned about 20 seconds before my reading started that the astrologer doing my reading was 20 years old. And they were incredibly good, very competent. But in that moment, when I learned that, I kind of had this post Saturn astrology came to me because I realized I was locating myself as an astrologer, as somebody who is post my Saturn return. This is not my
Okay.
first career. Um, I've lived through several complete cycles, and I feel, there's some talk like you shouldn't practice astrology till after your Saturn return. And I don't agree with that. I just want to clarify. I think some of the most exciting work in the field right now is being done by young astrologers, actually. But for me personally, to locate myself in the field of astrologers and to locate myself in terms of what I'm interested in, being a little older and later in life is a really large component of that for me, because I really value being able to look at not only what's happening now, but what was happening 8 years ago and 16 years ago, and when we have adult memories of those things, then we can start to see how patterns repeat, how we're winding up a spiral staircase, and maybe each time having a little more insight or awareness about what this pattern is. So that's mostly what it's about. And then, of course, other meanings kind of started flooding in, like Saturn represents the boundary of the visible universe. So I just thought it was really cool to think of like,
Oh,
hey, we're going a little beyond that. When we do a reading, we're reaching beyond what is immediately visible to our senses.
that's such a beautiful note for us to close on too, because that I think very much answers the question, that final question that I asked. And it also, I think, gives us some topics for our follow-up conversation, of which I'm hoping that we will be able to schedule for our watchers and listeners very soon. That is going to conclude our interview today. I encourage you to go to postsaturnastrology.com and schedule your consultation with Summer today. And Summer, thank you for your time. We're going to come back and revisit this and dive in a little bit deeper.
Thank you so much.